In this video, we are going to look at some of the limitations of fiscal policy. All right, so I already wrote the three that we're going to be looking at up on the board. Right, we have magnitude, we have timing, and we have real shocks. All right, now. We're not going to really spend a whole lot of time on magnitude. We've already discussed it. I might not even write anything down for it. We'll spend a little bit more time on timing, but the kind of the large portion of our time will be spent on real shocks for these limitations to fiscal policy. All right, so let's just go ahead and get started. So with magnitude, this is something we've already discussed about in the last This is something we already discussed in the last chapter, right? So most of the federal budget is already earmarked for other purposes. All right, so when we were going through chapter 36, we were looking at the federal budget. Right, we looked at all of those sources of spending. The top five made up, 80-ish%, something along those lines, of all spending, and then the rest had to take care of all the other functions, all the other things that the government needs to spend money on, right? Or at least the federal government. So farm subsidies, all right? Well, I don't know if they do farms. Anyways, paying for national parks, right? Paying for federal prisons, federal courts. The FDA, the FBI, so on and so forth. All right, there's a lot of things that money is already going to. All right, so the simple fact is that there's just not that much left to increase government spending with. All right, I mean that is basically it, right? So an older version of the textbook kind of referred to this as a drop in the bucket, right? The fact that what is available to the government to actually spend on some kind of expansionary fiscal policy, right, in comparison to the economy as a whole, right, is very small, right? Your book mentions the kind of stimulus package during the Obama presidency, right? And they said in the year where it was kind of the highest percentage, it only made up 1.6% of GDP, right? So when you don't have that much, and that was a massive program, right? So if you can't you don't have access to a large amount to increase your spending by, right, then you're not going to make large changes to aggregate demand, right? You're not going to see as large of an effect, right, just from that. All right, so magnitude is a limitation, right? There's just not that much money lying around to be used. All right, then timing, all right? So we haven't really talked that much about this, right? But with monetary policy, it is the Federal Reserve that kind of enacts that policy. With fiscal policy, it's the government, and specifically Congress and the president. All right, so fiscal policy decisions must be approved by Congress and the president. All right, and especially recently, right, or I guess recently, the last 12, 16 years, it seems, that's the prospect of something getting through Congress and being actually signed by the president is kind of something that we don't really see that often, or at least we don't expect it, at least for anything big, right? It takes time to get fiscal policy enacted, right? On top of that, we talked about how there were lags for the Fed when trying to use monetary policy, right? It takes a while to recognize that there is a problem. It takes time to kind of gather that data, right? Analyze it, right? Then it takes time to formulate a plan, put that plan into motion, and then kind of actually get the bureaucrats that are going to kind of facilitate that to actually do it, right? And all of that is true for fiscal policy as well, but you also have the additional step of it has to go through Congress, right? It has to go through the Senate and the House, and then it has to be approved by the president. And so it takes much longer. All right. One of the nice things about fiscal policy, and this is what I was going to say at the end of the last video, but didn't want to because it was going to make it too long. So fiscal policy is a lot more precise, right? In the last video, we were talking about the multiplier and talking about targeting where there are many unemployed workers or resources, right? And if we can put increased government spending there, we're going to have a higher multiplier. It's going to give us kind of more of that multiplier effect, right? So it's kind of, I've heard people say fiscal policy is monetary policy is a hatchet, fiscal policy is a scalpel, right? It's much more precise. But one of the bad things about it is that it does take time, right? It takes more time than the Fed because the Fed is fairly autonomous in what it can do, right? However, there have been things put in place to kind of mitigate this amount of time it takes, right? And these are known as automatic stabilizers. All right, so automatic stabilizers, for the textbook definition, all right, this is fiscal policy that stimulates aggregate demand in a recession without the need for explicit action by policymakers. All right, so these are things that are already put in place, right, that they don't need to be voted on, and that just happen, right? Probably figured that out because it's called an automatic stabilizer. Right, so a couple of examples. Right, so as we discussed in chapter 36, the U.S. operates, at least especially on the income tax side, right, operates under a progressive tax system, right? So that is an automatic stabilizer. When, if we have a recession, your income starts going down, right, you're going to have to pay less in taxes, right? So the idea here is that now that you're paying less in taxes, right, it's not going to, make your income falling great, right? It's not going to turn it into a positive, right? But what it can do is soften the blow, right? So your pre-tax income has gone down, right? Your post-tax income has also gone down, but not by as much, right? Because you're not having to pay as high of a tax rate if you fell out of your tax bracket, right? Or you're just not having to pay as that tax rate on as much of your income, right? And so again, kind of more soften the blow, not necessarily to just kind of make it completely better. All right, other things, welfare, right? That's another example of this, right? When we have a recession, we're going to see more people, right, need kind of that assistance, right? And so it's already there, right? The welfare system, all right? Whatever kind of transfers, whatever kind of things are available to you, right? You can just go to whatever government office you need to and get that all set up, right? You don't have to wait for Congress to get that started for you. All right, but that is our timing. So again, it takes a long time to get, just to get to know that there is an issue, right? It takes even longer to get a solution passed through Congress and then implemented, all right? But to combat that, we do have these automatic stabilizers. All right. The next thing, right, our next limitation are real shocks. All right, I would kind of hesitate to even write that up here. Actually, no, just you guys give yourself a heading, but this is going to start with a graph, so I want to give us as much so you guys can see this as clearly as possible. All right, because as we all know, these can get really cluttered really quickly. All right, so just as a reminder, if in case anybody has forgotten, but a real shock is a shock that affects long-run aggregate supply. So it's a shock to or kind of a shock that decreases an economy's fundamental ability to produce goods and services, right? So I'm going to get our setup done. All right, I'm going to leave out our initial short-run aggregate supply curve. If we want to just imagine it's there, right? It's just going to be like that. But we're not going to really use it, so and it'd just be one more thing, one more line on our graph. All right, we don't necessarily need that, right? But so here we start at our long-run equilibrium, right? Then we have our negative real shock, right? So negative real shocks, we know those are not great. When we were looking at the chapter on the, how many lines do I have? Okay, I think I can do another one. All right, when we were looking at, well, I already forgot what I was going to say. Oh, when we were looking at our monetary policy, the chapter on monetary policy, we saw that monetary policy wasn't great against real shocks either. All right. So we have our negative real shock. Right. Then we're going to now include our short-run aggregate supply curve. I'm going to say that's SRAS1 just to keep to be in keeping with what's going on here, LRAS. Anyways, so then, all right, so that's where we're at, right? We get this new long-run equilibrium, right? We've got a higher inflation rate and we've got a lower real GDP growth rate. So not a good situation, right? One of the reasons, before we actually start doing stuff, one of the reasons that fiscal policy is not good at combating real shocks is because, as we know, fiscal policy is most effective when it is when there are many unemployed resources, right? A negative shock, right, does not mean that we have many unemployed resources, right? So a negative shock to long-run aggregate supply, right? It could be the case that this is a fully employed economy, that there are not many unemployed resources, right? Or at least not compared to what we had before, right? So what we had at this long-run aggregate supply, right? It may be about the same, right? So we might not have that many. We don't really have any inefficiency, is what we're saying. All right, so any government spending is going to crowd out the private spending. All right, but let's continue looking at our actual example. All right, so we have our new long-run equilibrium, right? The government wants to do something, right? They don't want this high inflation. They don't want this, well, really, it's mostly they don't want this low growth rate, right? But again, they don't have really many options. They try to do expansionary fiscal policy. All right, we're going to see something that's very similar to what we saw with the monetary policy. In fact, if you go look, you'll probably find graphs that look almost exactly the same as the ones I'm drawing now. All right, but we get this new short-run equilibrium where our new aggregate demand curve intersects our new short-run aggregate supply curve. We get a boost to real GDP growth, right? We also have an increase in inflation, right? But that's the best that can be hoped for, right? And that's all that you can really count on. You get a short-run boost, but as we know, money is neutral in the long run. Eventually, we're going to come back to where we have an intersection between our new aggregate demand curve and our long-run aggregate supply curve. We're going to come back to this lower solo growth rate, all right, in comparison to this one, right? So we're going to go from this blue growth rate, that's the little boost, back to our new solo growth rate, and we're going to end up once again with just higher inflation, right? When combating real shocks, fiscal policy just is not a very good option, right? Really, the only thing you can do is try to get short-run boost to real growth while taking on a higher and higher inflation rate. All right, so the last thing that we're going to do, and this will wrap up the chapter for us, is just quickly summarize a couple points, right? And look at this question, right? So when is fiscal policy most effective? All right, so we're really just summarizing here. We've already talked about this. All right, so when used to face a negative shock to aggregate demand, right, as we saw in our multiplier example, right, so that's a big one, right? If we're not having to mess with real shocks, right, it's most effective, right? Also, during times with many unemployed workers and resources, all right, and then lastly, this is kind of a sub one, all right? When the policy can target the unemployed. That sounds a little sinister, but I hope you guys know what I mean, right? So when our fiscal policy can be targeted towards, right, people that are unemployed, or again, just people that will spend that money quickly, as we discussed in the last video. All right, but those kind of are the things. Really, these two, definitely. Well, all of them definitely. This one can kind of go under this one, right? If we have many unemployed workers and resources, then we don't really have to target. But if we don't, then it's good when we can target those unemployed resources. All right. But that is it for this chapter.